Hey yo, today we're going to talk a little bit about spiritual institutions, what it's like to be inside a monastery behind the scenes. Man, I woke up this morning, I was ready to do some busy work that I've been putting off. I opened my email, fascinating email from a friend of mine, and now I have to make this video. Okay, friend says, I'm thinking about how it's a mistake to do Buddhism for a living, like to make it your source of income. I think that's where a lot of trouble begins. So much bad stuff stems from this. They need to make sure donations are coming in by saying and doing things that attract donors and not saying/doing things that might scare them off. That's maybe the main thing, but there's a lot more. I was thinking about people who try to be monks for life. That is, they go to a monastery and stay there as long as possible because it shields them from having to get a real job. I saw folks like this at the place where this person was. I suppose you did too at the Mount Baldy Zen Center where I was. I mean, where's the line between being committed to a full-time practice and just sort of hanging in there to avoid doing something else? Is there a line? These are very deep questions that you live with when you live at a monastery, as I did I lived at a monastery for 10 years, and then I was the director of a temple for 3 years. So it's 13 years of full-time monastic life. And what I want to do today is just take you behind the curtain and show you some things about, show you some of the human aspects at the core of spiritual institutions. It's going to be like that scene in The Wizard of Oz when you see the old man behind the curtain pulling the levers, right? And making the great big Wizard of Oz hologram speak to all the people of Oz, right? We're going to pull back that curtain. So first of all, every monastery and every monastic system, every spiritual institution or organization is probably going to be a little bit different. It's going to do these things in their own sort of homespun way, some more dysfunctional than others. My teacher had an unspoken but very clear system. It was homemade to his character and his style of teaching, and it was almost breathtakingly dysfunctional in certain ways and profoundly functional in other ways. So his system was this. He had a bunch of different training centers around the US. The Mount Baldy Zen Center was his main monastic style training center. My teacher lived there for half of the year. Summer, Seichu training, intensive training program, winter Seichu intensive training program. So during these intensive training programs, he would hold Daiseshin retreats, which were the really intense 7-day retreats. And then when we were doing those 1 to 2 weeks a month. And then when we weren't doing that, we were basically doing the same hardcore Zen training schedule, just a lighter version. Now, you do a Seichu as a student, right? So you would come, you would pay some money to do the Seichu. You would live at the monastery for, stay through 3 months, and everything is very unspoken and informal, but perhaps you would want to stay on and be at the monastery. Now you might become a scholarship student. So you would submit a application to be a scholarship student, and now you would live there for free and you would help the Zen Center. So there was another unspoken rule that you could only be a scholarship student for like 2 years. And then it's like, okay, put a ring on it. You gotta get ordained, right? Get ordained or leave. So Roshi had these ways of turning up heat. So I remember there was a student when I was the shika or the head monk, and he was a fine man, but he was perhaps avoiding his girlfriend who was out in the real world, and avoiding job, avoiding family, and he was a drinker, okay? So there were a lot of issues there. So he was a bit of a carbuncle, fixed to the hull of the ship of our Zen practice, right? And Roshi would make an effort to scrape those carbuncles off. So I remember at one point, I was wheeling Roshi into the dining hall, and he saw this student in there, because the student was the shoden, or the little densu, which is the person who's in charge of helping the sutra hall practice in there. And he pointed at the student, and he just shot this laser beam of criticism across the room at him. It came out of nowhere. It was like, why aren't you with your girlfriend? Your woman is out there somewhere, just waiting for you while you play Zen up here like a little boy at summer camp. And he's screaming at him. And it was kind of the case. I mean, he wasn't committing to the student wasn't committing to becoming a monk, and he wasn't graduating from scholarship practice as a Zen student and going back out into the world renewed to commit to his life, right? He was somewhere in between, and Roshi just hammered him. Eventually the student left, right? But sometimes you would then go on from scholarship student status to become a monk. Tokudo Shiki was the ceremony, big ceremony. You have to buy a bunch of fabric, or no, people buy the fabric for you, I think is how it went. And then you have to make all your robes. It is a massive process. I had help making my robes. I made my white, there's like hakama, koromo, there's your belt, there's your kesa, there's your rukasu. There's tons of robes that have to be sewn to a certain specification, right? So it's a commitment, and you're going to get a new name, and you're going to get your head shaved, and you're going to have a ceremony where you bow to your parents and say, sayonara, won't be seeing you at any of the holidays for the next 10 years. So it was a very, very serious commitment. You are called an Unsui, which is a floating cloud flowing water. You're joining the flow of the tradition as embodied by the training in this temple, as led by this teacher. You're going with the flow for a while. But that doesn't last for long. Pretty soon you have to manifest in officer positions. You've got to train as a jikijitsu, the shika, the densu, the tenzo, and ultimately the head monk. So all responsibilities on camp are split up into different officer positions. So the shoji, for example, shoji is the caring figure on camp, and they take care of like all the work, like the work that needs to be done on camp, taking care of the place. They're also in charge of serving tea in the Zendo and making sure the Zendo is clean and organized, etc., right? So that's the shoji's job. The tenzo is the cook. You are keeping people alive. It's an interesting feeling. Like after about a week or so, when you're tenzo during a training season, you realize, oh my gosh, all these people are alive on my food. It's a big responsibility. Then you're the jikijitsu. You are the disciplinarian in the meditation hall. So you keep that atmosphere tight, strong, and clear, etc. So you have to train in every one of these officer roles when you're a new monk, right? Eventually, you're around for a long enough time to where you get the responsibility of head monk or shika. Now that's a role that has a different quality than the other roles. You're meeting with the abbot or the head teacher, the roshi of the temple, of the training center, once a day. And you're reporting to him on the finances, right? So I used to bring in these big, massive sheets of financial stuff. Every penny we're spending, every penny we're earning, right? You're going to the teacher with problems with students. Oftentimes you get mentally ill people who come to monasteries, and you're in a tricky position now. We are not psychiatrists. We are not psychologists. We are not therapists. You know, you get problematic people who come to monasteries. So you have to go to the teacher. It's not your responsibility. You're the lieutenant, and you have to go to the general. It's a terrible job, Shika, on some level, because you are the fall guy for everything bad happening at the monastery. Everybody blames everything on you because the teacher has to be pristine in the eyes of his students. I mean, that was the vibe that I got. And I was happy to do it, but it wasn't fun. I loved my teacher, and I knew the score. I would take hits for him again and again and again. And it's very interesting to be in that role of shika. You see how people think. you see how they want their spiritual icon. They want their teacher to be out of reach because it allows them to reach and reach and reach out of themselves in a beautiful way. I mean, I couldn't have gone through this hard training without having had this model of transcendence, which my teacher was. The great thing about being Shika is that you get to see behind the scenes. It's very funny, like people would come up to me and say, Roshi, I couldn't believe it. He asked me in Sanzen in our koan practice, he stopped the koan and he said, how is it with your wife? Is her body okay? It's like he read my mind because I was so worried because she's been having these problems with her fallopian tubes and the doctor, this and that. I mean, he is amazing. And you can see them charged with this inspiration. Well, the bottom line was Roshi wanted to know about this student, and so a bunch of injis or attendants were gossiping, okay? They were gossiping about the guy's wife, all right? And then Roshi brought that into Sanzen. Oh, how's your wife, you know? And then the person, they project all these things onto the teacher, right? So they project all the good things onto the teacher. The theory is, as I've heard Natalie Goldman, who's a Zen practitioner and a writer, put it in one of her books about her teacher, who I believe was Katagiri Roshi, in her book, The Great Failure. She said that you project all these qualities onto the teacher when you first start in Zen practice, and then you slowly have to reclaim those qualities for yourself, right? So my job as the Shika or the head monk was to be the bad guy. It's the guy they project all the bad stuff onto in the monastery. They called me the Kaiser at Mount Baldy because I had to like maintain a certain level of discipline on the grounds. I had to make sure that, you know, everything was running smoothly for our teacher. So I was running around being the Kaiser, I guess. So you're the Kaiser for a while. You're the head monk. You're working with Roshi behind the scenes. And you really begin to see how things work. You begin to see how a monastery is a kind of an organism. Everybody's working together to produce this environment where training is possible, where practice is possible. And it's very hermetically sealed, right? It's a very protected environment. And within that environment, people who often come who are not killing it in the world. Like, we never, apart from Leonard Cohen, we very, very rarely had people who were doing really well in the business world, in the arts world, as college professors. I mean, it was rare. We definitely had them. There were some real successful people that came to train with Roshi, but he had a way of turning these people away. He had a way of turning away big money donors. He had a way of insulting them, and he had a way of insulting successful people. And there are very different ways of interpreting this. You could say that he wanted to be the alpha dog, and that was that. Maybe there's an element of that. You could also say that these people were coming in with elements of ego, and they wanted to have Zen practice be another part of their amazing personality, their amazing successful life. And Roshi would cut them down at the knees, oftentimes publicly in the most insulting manner possible. So, actually Leonard Cohen has talked a lot about this. You can Google Sasaki Roshi, Leonard Cohen, and you can find stories like this. Okay, so you are the head monk. You're seeing everything. It's such a privilege to be in that position because you see everything. And you're never the same. Like, you know what it's like now to be Pope, to be a bishop in the Vatican. You know what it's like to be a guru in the charnel grounds in Varanasi in India. You know what it's like to be at the head of the Mormon Church. You know how every single spiritual organization works because they all work the same. So what happens is people get really good at being in a monastery. And by the time you're shika, and maybe you do a few rounds as shika, so usually you are in an officer position for 6 months. So let's say you're a new monk and you're being trained to be densu, which is the person in charge of the sutra hall and the ceremonial aspects of Zen practice. So you be shoden, which is small densu. You're training for 3 months, usually in the seikan, semi-formal training period, when the teacher is not on the ground. An older monk or more experienced nun takes you under their wing as the densu. You're the shoden. They train you in the position. And then when the training season arrives, you are the densu. And you're in that role for 3 months. So you cycle through all these roles. And you cycle through the role of head monk for a while, and, for a few rounds. And you get pretty good at being a monk, right? You get pretty good at knowing exactly how to make the bread so that it's maximally nutritious, not too tasty, but tasty enough when you're tenzo. You figure out how, when you're densu, to get wax off the butsudan, right? You take a paper towel, fold it a few times, put it on top of the dried wax. You take an iron and you go like this, just a little bit, and all the wax soaks up from the wood into the paper towel. Quite a trick, wouldn't you say? You learn how to use the keisaku as jikijitsu. The keisaku is the big wooden stick. I'm at my friend's apartment. He has one here somewhere. The keisaku is the stick that you use to the encouragement stick, we call it, you use it on people in the Zendo. You smack their shoulder. You learn to perfectly hit the shoulder so that it, like right here, the meat right at the trapezoid muscle, so that it gives off this snap. Like, you learn these little things that are totally irrelevant in the great big spiritual human galactic picture. Totally irrelevant, right? You went to a monastery to learn the Buddha way, and you've discovered how to get dried wax off an altar. Good on you, bro, you know? So you get good at being a monk, and you're really good. Like, you're like, I don't know, if you were a lawyer, you'd be made partner, you know? But these are not skills that mean anything anywhere else on the planet except a monastery. And the truth is, you stuck it out for so long at the monastery because you probably didn't have a ton on the ball in the real world. Like, you came to the monastery with questions and problems, right? We used to say that the Mount Baldy was like the last stop before the noose, you know? And it was, in a lot of ways. It was the last stop for people who were very troubled, and people found a home there, and they found a way of life. You're at the top of the heap as the head monk. So much respect that people would give you. Yes, they projected all the problems of the monastery on you, but you got so much respect. I mean, you're like, not celebrity isn't the right word, but it's not necessarily the wrong word. I mean, people, they revered Roshi, but they respected you. And sometimes that's the first time in your life you've ever felt that kind of respect. I mean, it certainly was for me. And also, you are proud of yourself. I was proud of myself because I was handling massive responsibilities. When I think about some of the stuff that I did, it's pretty astonishing. I mean, and this is Hashinkuji, which is the first day of retreat. I've now got a 7-day retreat ahead of me that I have to lead as Shika. I mean, you really get a power and an energy. I mean, Mount Baldy monks were warriors. They such an amazing thing, right? And yet none of it means anything anywhere except in that very specific environment. And right when you're at the top of your game, Roshi tells you, and he did this for a very small number of monks, because most people don't make it that far, to where you've been head monk for a few rounds, over a few years. Most people just, they get married, they meet a student, they get married, or they decide, yeah, I've had enough of this crazy life, they quit. But a few people go through that training, go through that training, go through that training, and at some point, Roshi says, now you become a priest. It's like a great honor, wow. So you go through a new ceremony now called Suiji Shiki. Now, this is the path of the monks. So you were a scholarship student, then you became a Tokudo Shiki Unsui, or fresh monk. Then you cycle through all the officer positions and you train in them for several years. Then you become the head monk. Then you cycle out of that position, you go back down to being a lowly cook or jikijitsu, and then you cycle back in at some point to the shika, the head monk position. You be the head monk a few more times. Now you become an osho, or a priest. What does that mean? It means it's time for you to go. So the system was very clear at the Mount Baldy Zen Center where I trained. You do not stay there. There are no spiritual professionals. You have to leave that institution. You cannot stay. So he would push people out. So becoming an Osho meant now you have to go out, start an affiliate temple or sitting group, and offer the practice yourself. I mean, it was really brutal. You spend 10, 12 years full-time in the monastery, and then your best work years, your reproductive years, and then you get a little dinner and a bunch of resentful young monks who are so sick of you, say, see you later, and that's it. You're like out on the street. So that was how the whole thing worked. And it will never work that way again in that community because my teacher died and he didn't have a successor. And now you've got some spiritual professionals who are living full-time at some of those old institutions where I trained, and they've got boards of directors who are cutting them checks and monthly, and it's just not the same anymore. But my teacher had a very clear system, and there were problems with that system, and there was, you could call it maybe an ideology or principles behind that system. Now, here's how I took the principles, or what I got from it, okay? Like, it's really, really important to leave the Zendo behind when you leave the Zendo. Otherwise, you stink of Zen. There's that whole statement when teaching that a student is talking about Zen and the teacher says, you stink of Zen. And most spiritual professionals stink of their profession. You get, as I said, you get good at being a monk. You get good at living that life. It's weirdly comfortable. It's meaningful. It really, like all of you who have not lived full-time at a monastery, and you may wonder if it's a meaningful existence, it is. I mean, it is. Especially if you have a good model for the Dharma, which for all his many deep flaws, I think for me at least, my teacher in certain ways really was a model for the essence of the tradition. It's a meaningful life, but it's hermetically sealed, and you become childish. I have a friend who is a Zen teacher, and I look at this guy, and I'm like, you're like a billionaire who doesn't have a penny to his name. That's what he's like. Like, he's becoming eccentric because he's not really in the real world. He's got this stable of people, this board of directors that believes in him and kind of serves him. and takes care of his needs and kind of pays his bills and takes care of the rent and takes care of all the responsibilities at the temple and treats him very well and scurries around when he's around and asks him this and asks him this and asks him this and what about this and what about this and what about this. And so he's like but he's doing they're serving him so that he can serve them. He's like he's like the CEO of this organization. He's a celebrity amongst like this 50, 60 people, you know? And there are ways that he's disconnected with reality, and it's very fundamental ways. And he has learned to relate to the world as a spiritual professional. And the people within his organization think that the tradition is accurately reflected and that the teachings are most purely reflected in how he relates to the world. But that's not necessarily the case. Like, you learn how to be a Zen teacher. You learn how to do the role. I mean, you learn how to hold yourself, you know? You learn how to speak to people. You learn how to speak about the teachings. There's just a certain way of giving a Dharma talk that communicates authority. And you have to give these Dharma talks to your congregation week after week after week. And so there are certain techniques you use and certain tones of voice that you use. You know, you're just being a monk, you know, you're just being a spiritual professional. You're being a teacher, right? But people mistake all this stuff for being the essence of Zen, right? But it's not. It's just the role of teacher or the role of monk, right? Learning how to get dried wax off the butsudan with a hot iron and a paper towel, you know? True Dharma manifests in the moment, and it's free of Zen practice. It's free of the monastery, it's free of the teachers, it's free of the teachings. And that's why my teacher kicked his monks out. Yes, they were supposed to go start temples and become teachers themselves, but they were going to have to find a way to finance that themselves, right? And very few teachers, oshos or priests in my lineage were able to make a buck off of Zen, right? They were carpenters, one was a lawyer, massage therapists or rolfers or cranial sacral therapists. Like, people had to go out into the world and find themselves, the ox-herding pictures, famous Zen ox-herding pictures, find themselves back in the marketplace again, right back where they started. You're not a hot shot monk anymore. You're not the head monk. You're not in this little culty environment of where your robes mean something. You're in the human world, the marketplace. That's where, and then Zen disappears. It just disappears. There's no Zen there. It's a three-letter word that means nothing. Now what? Whatever manifests between you and your surroundings in those moments, that's what's true. That's what the practice is. That's what's real. Everything else is a kind of training. It's a kind of performance. It's a ritual. It's a tradition. It's a lineage. It's an institution. It's an organization, right? With politics, with bills to pay, with people to please, with enemies. I mean, that Kissinger quote about academia, the infighting is so intense because the stakes are so low, that definitely applies to a monastery. The infighting is so intense because the stakes are so low and everybody outperforming each other with the crispness of their freshly washed robes or the frayed rakusu because they've been practicing so intensely for so long. You know, all this stuff goes on in a monastery behind the scenes, and it's all beautiful. It's all a kind of training. It's all a kind of great big feast, and you consume it all, and it becomes part of your body and gives you energy, and then you go out into the world and do something with that energy. But none of this stuff, from the robes to the teacher, even to the sitting and all the form in the Zendo, all of that is stuff that just has to be dropped. Has to be dropped. It has to be dropped when you leave the meditation hall and interact in a new way with the world around you. And it has to be dropped after 12, 13 years when you get out of the monastery and you take off your full-time robes and you're a lay priest like I am now. So again and again and again here on this channel, Zen Confidential, I return to the importance of the lay life. Like I look in this camera that I'm looking at and I see a lay practitioner of Zen Buddhism or a human being. I don't think I'm looking at a monk or a priest or a spiritual professional. I'm looking at a person who sits on a damn cushion like this in their living room, right? Twice a day maybe. So you can go to a monastery for 13 years and wind up sitting on a cushion twice a day in your living room, or you can sit twice a day on a cushion in your living room for those 13 years while living the lay life. But either way, in the end, you gotta drop the practice and like manifest in the real world without the crutch of the organization or the institution holding you up.